Okay, so this is the first real video in the sequence on what I'm calling Linuxing, um, just how to use Linux and what Linux is. We're going to start off with that, actually. What is Linux? So I'm going to open up a browser tab here, and I'm going to ask Wikipedia what Linux is. So let's go to Linux, and here's our penguin mascot. You probably have seen this next to like the Windows window logo and the Mac OS, whatever they're using as their logo these days. So here's the thing. Linux, the salient point I want to make here is that up top here, this article is about the family of operating systems. For the kernel, see Linux kernel. For other uses, see Linux disambiguation. So Linux kernel is the kind of the core of the operating system, and this will be the same mostly. I mean, there's different versions of it, right? So the latest release version is 5.16.11. Okay, that's the most recent official release of the Linux kernel. But not every distribution of Linux uses the same version of the kernel at the same time, and we're going to talk about what a distribution is in a moment. So the history of Linux is essentially that it was a, you can see, it was a, it's a kernel. It's a Unix-like operating system kernel. Now a kernel just, this is kind of what you need to know about a kernel, okay? So the kernel is like the core of the operating system that interacts with all of the programs that run, okay? So the kernel is kind of what you think of as the operating system, but you also typically think about like a lot of basic tools that are actually programs and not part of the kernel as part of the operating system. So like maybe Notepad on Windows is a program. It's not part of Windows, the kernel of Windows, but it's part of the Windows operating system. It comes installed on all Windows. You'll see that a lot with a lot of the tools we talk about that come with a Linux distribution when you install it. It's important to know that this Linux dates back to the early 90s, and this guy is a Finnish dude who originally wrote it. It was originally Linus's Unix, I believe. So, and Unix just means Unix is the granddaddy of modern operating systems, except for Windows. So, if you look at this is a timeline going back to the original Unix version 1 to 4 here, and Unix spawned all of these operating systems. So, Linux is the second bar right here, and then if you look at, let's see, Mac OS X is kind of hybrid, mixed open source and closed source. Red is closed source, so they took that source code or designed it after that, and then they kind of made it inaccessible to the public. But Linux is all open source. You can read the Linux kernel if you want to, and you can also help contribute to it if you want to, and they accept a patch, although that's kind of hard to do because that's pretty advanced operating system programming. So, anyway, so the Linux kernel is the core of the operating system, and it's packaged with some tools to make Linux the operating system. So what comes in so distributions include the Linux kernel and supporting system software and libraries, many of which are provided by the GNU project. This is the GNU of the GNU project, okay? New, I guess. So it was started by this guy who's kind of been semi-canceled, I think, but he's like another like father of modern computering and stuff. So he's 68, huh? So he started this program to create a lot of free tools. So Linus, when he was creating Linux, and people afterwards ended up packaging a lot of the GNU tools like that ran on the computer that Linux ran on. Linux was the kernel, and then these were all the tools that came with it. And the Free Software Foundation, which is kind of affiliated with the GNU project, uses the name GNU Linux to emphasize the importance of GNU software, causing some controversy. So that's fun to know about. Popular Linux distributions include Debian, Fedora, and Ubuntu. So commercial distributions include Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, and SUSE. So not every Linux distribution is intended as just an operating system for your computer. A lot of larger companies that use Linux instead of Windows will use something like Red Hat because it offers like enterprise level support and things like that that you might not get if you just install Debian on a bunch of computers. But what I mean by distribution is, let's go to this article. So it's kind of, so it comes with the Linux kernel to run the operating system, or that is the operating system, the core of it. And then it comes with a lot of the same tools that other distributions come with, but it also includes their own specific tools, including a package management system. That is very important. We'll talk about that. So, here, let's see. A typical Linux distribution comprises the kernel, the GNU tools and libraries, additional software documentation, and then if you want to install a graphical interface to it, remember that's on top of the command line interface, kind of. The Windows system, which is typically X, the X Windows system, or Wayland is kind of newer and it's still in development. I would not use Wayland yet, probably. Although that's kind of what everybody's been saying for a decade now. The window manager sits on top of X, and a desktop environment sits on top of the window manager. And that kind of gives you something that looks like this. This is like Ubuntu, I think. Ubuntu, one of the most popular Linux distributions. Distributions can be based on other distributions, so Ubuntu is actually based on Debian. They take Debian and then modify it and then spit it out. But Ubuntu, I will say, I don't use Ubuntu very much, but I will credit it for really making Linux easier and more accessible. So that was pretty big when it came out. So how popular is Linux? So that's the thing. Linux was originally developed for personal computers based on x86. x86 is probably what you think of as like a desktop computer will probably be x86, unless it's one of the more recent Macs that has the M1 chip in it. Since been ported to more platforms than any other operating system. That's true. Android has the Linux kernel at its core. And Linux also has the largest installed base of all general-purpose operating systems. So, Linux only used by 2.3% of desktop computers, but Chromebooks, Chrome OS runs the Linux kernel. I'm not sure if I knew that. And then also, Linux is used on servers. So almost all the servers in the cloud are Linux. Especially because it's free and it's reliable. Even if you move distributions, you have to switch a distribution, you'll still know essentially how to use Linux. And it's a command line first interface there with a server because you might not have a graphical interface to a computer sitting 1,000 miles away. Compared to Windows, Windows can be set up over the command line, but that's not what I think it's primarily intended for. The other thing is that a lot of the smart devices that you see nowadays have a Linux kernel in them, especially like an old Linux kernel, because these devices aren't updated very often. So, and then, this is another note here. Linux is one of the most prominent examples of open source software. So if you want to just search Linux source code. Okay, so then the site for Linux, the Linux kernel is kernel.org. This is the official kind of like all of these are the kernels, okay? So these are long-term releases, and then this most stable release is 5.16.11, and the mainline release is 5.17 release client 5. So it's release candidate 5, I think, and that's the next one that's going to be stable, essentially, once they fix all the kinks. That's like beta, essentially. What I'm running right now, if I am on a Linux system right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to, we'll see what kind of Linux kernel I'm running. So I'm going to search my package manager for Linux. You can see the actual Linux package here is 5.16.11. That is the most recent version. That's kind of unusual, actually, because I am on Arch, which uses a very recent, like, it's called a rolling package management system, where as soon as a package is updated and pushed, it's supposed to be updated in the, like, to stable, it's supposed to be pushed. Now, not every distribution will update their packages that often. A lot of them use these more long-term packages, or they just update it less frequently so that things break less often. That's the upside of not getting the most recent packages all the time. So that people can test, like the people that manage the distribution can test what software works with this most recent kernel, what doesn't, and fix all the bugs before they release it all as kind of one big unit a few times a year or whatever. So if you want to install Linux, you'll have to probably get a distribution. It's possible to install it from this source code and then just like build a system completely from scratch. I might try that one day. The distribution that I would suggest, that's without a distribution, but if you want a distribution with that, I would search for Gentoo Linux. This is the most famous from source distribution. So what this does is, the idea is you compile the kernel yourself, and you can modify a lot of things, basically, when you... Oh, I see. Installing Gentoo works a bit differently than other Linux distributions. Yeah, that's kind of correct. But if I was going to get started with Linux, the question I would ask you is kind of what's your free time look like right now? Because you can get started with Ubuntu immediately and essentially just spend a week learning the ins and outs of the graphical user interface and go from there. But it'll be about how much you know if you've been using Mac OS for years and haven't delved into the deep operating system components. Or really figured out how it works or how Windows works. And remember, a lot of that is proprietary. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't just go browse the source code. I've never actually read the Linux source code. If you want to, you can go. This is a copy of it here. Or maybe it actually is developed on Linux these days. Or GitHub, I mean. So this is the Linux kernel. This is it right here. Let's start this. This is very important. So look at all these directories. That's ridiculous. Look at it, and it has 1 million commits. Over 1 million commits to this. The last commit was 19 hours ago. So you can see merge tags. So 5.17 RC4. Remember when we looked at the kernel archive, RC5 was the most recent version. So this was updated 19 hours ago. But then, yeah, you can see. And then if you see credits, this is a really long file of everybody who's contributed to the Linux kernel. All these people have pushed a commit at one point, okay? Anyway. So that's the kernel. You can go bounce around there if you want. Contributors, see, like plus 12,000 contributors. Look at that. Everybody wants to work. It's a big deal to get your name in the kernel. So anyway, let's see. So one thing you might try, like I said, how much free time do you have? So what distro should I use? That means Linux. And see, distrochooser.de, best Linux distros of 2022. Let's try this. Let's see what happens here. Distro chooser. See, there's the penguin. This test will help you choose a suitable Linux distribution. Start test. This might be interesting. I've never used this before. I want to use Linux for anonymous web browsing. There are some distributions that are focused on privacy. Let's see. I just want a distribution for daily use. Proceed. How would you rate your proficiency using a computer? I mean, with help. That's the thing. Like, there's a difference between I'm already able to solve home computer problems by myself and I can troubleshoot most or all computer problems by myself, which is I read Stack Overflow and Server Fault and Super User to determine how to solve problems, and the Arch forums. Let's see. How would you rate your knowledge of Linux itself? I have a good understanding, but you might not. So how many settings do you wish to tweak by yourself during installation? I want to choose the settings by myself. So anyway, your hardware probably supports 64-bit unless you're using a really old operating system. Ooh. Many distributions ship a desktop as default. That is true. So Windows-like would be... I can see what they're getting at here. This would be KDE and this would be GNOME, the two most popular distro. Well, I don't know these days. There are a lot of ones these days. I'll take a Windows-like user interface. Most distributions are free. No, I prefer a free-to-use distribution. Never pay for Linux. As an individual, I mean. Different distributions pre-install different amounts of software. Some install a complete set of... Let's see... I want to choose the basic programs to install. And I'm fine with non-free licenses as long as my system works. That's another thing. So, there are... Software comes with licenses. You probably know this if you've worked with, like, developing applications before. Like NPM will ask you... When you NPM init a package, it'll ask you, what kind of license do you want on this? And some licenses say... Even if it's the ideology is contentious. Some of the licenses kind of say you cannot use this for certain purposes, or they lock you down more. And some people believe that it's really important to not use software that does not come with a really free license. I'm not a stickler on this, although I admit I probably should be. Some distributions use online services to improve the user experience. So that's the thing. Not every distribution does this. I'm just going to skip this question. There are many ways to administer. I want to install software using terminal commands. I want to avoid systemd. Don't check this. Systemd is good. Okay, just that's what I'm going to tell you. Some distributions offer fast updates. I prefer fast updates. Get result. And what does it say? Arch. Yep, that's what I use. Now here, void without systemd. That's interesting. Gen 2 is interesting. I might try that someday. Advanced users. Arch is what I use to learn Linux. Okay, so if you go to the Arch homepage, it's not very like graphical everywhere, but you can install it. It's not impossible for someone who knows a little bit about a computer. I went the hard way. I kind of I downloaded Arch, I installed it, and then I didn't let myself not use it. All you need is the image file, and then you can install it to a computer or to a virtual machine. When we start using a distribution in the next video, we'll be using a virtual machine on this computer as if it was an actual computer. That might be an easier thing. So if you want to install a distro, what you want to do is either download this ISO with BitTorrent. In this case, it's legal to use BitTorrent. You can just get this magnet link or the torrent file, and you can download the ISO, and then burn it onto a USB stick. And you can Google how to do that. Or if it's a virtual machine, you can just load the ISO directly when you start the operating system and install it. Now, this might give you this is an interesting kind of test. This is interesting. I like this. But let's look at the best Linux distributions of 2022. So, Nitrux, best distro for beginners. So when they say beginners, it's easy customizations. Zorin, best distro for Windows users. Some of these are newer. These first three are actually pretty new. yeah, so, oh wow, I haven't heard of a lot of these before. Manjaro is based on Arch, but it's more, so you get the benefits of Arch. I like Manjaro. It's based on Arch, but it's more user friendly. We might try that actually. Puppy Linux, it's really small. Arch Linux, that's, you've seen that. So there's a Raspberry Pi Linux, Ubuntu, okay, and Debian. They mention the education spin on the distro and the server spin on the Ubuntu page, but Ubuntu and Debian are fine choices for desktop Linux. So if you go to the Ubuntu page, this is a lot more like a modern website looks like. Oh, see, Arch didn't ask me about cookies because I don't think this has any. This is not tracking me, but this site will track me. I will just accept the Ubuntu cookies. I don't know if you want to. So let's see. Ubuntu developer download. Ubuntu desktop. You're gonna want probably 21.10. Don't worry about the LTS if you're just installing it for your own computer. This means it's like more it's supported for a longer term. If you download this, it's going to download an ISO file. That's this Ubuntu desktop AMD64.ISO. It'll automatically detect your computer type. And then there's some more stuff here. So when we get started in the next video with the actual using the distribution, I think I'm going to start with a graphical interface and then move back to the command line so that it's mirroring the experience. So if you have tons of time, I would say learn Arch. Arch is difficult, but it will teach you how to learn Linux the hard way, which is the way that actually you learn everything. This is how you get to where I am, where you can kind of troubleshoot most of your problems. Now, if you go with a distribution like Ubuntu, okay, let's see. Let's not download that. If you go with a distribution like Ubuntu, the thing is, you won't learn how to solve problems as much, but you'll run into fewer problems because the packages are not as updated as frequently. There's more quality control. Less is left to the user. That's kind of what I would say. I'm going to start off with something like Ubuntu in the next video, and then we'll go from there, okay? Thank you for watching this first video, and let's get started. How about that?